Brennan is a former CIA agent and is an informal foreign policy advisor to Barack Obama's campaign. China is threatening to smash the protests in Tibet, where up to 100 people have died over the past 2 weeks. An editorial in the People's Daily said opposition to Chinese rule in the Himalayan region must be wiped out. The editorial stated, quote, China must resolutely crush the conspiracy of sabotage and smash Tibet independence forces. The Chinese government recently posted online wanted posters for 21 Tibetan activists. On Friday, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited the Dalai Lama in India and demanded China come clean on repression in Tibet.
The situation in Tibet is a challenge to the conscience of the world. It's a challenge to the conscience of the world that I hope that we can help meet. It is a situation where we need to know what is happening there, and the world needs to know. And so we come here and say to you, we are with you to meet that challenge. We thank you for the inspiration that you are to the world, and thank you for the courage that you give us to join you in this.
The World Food Program has launched an extraordinary emergency appeal to raise at least $500 million in the next 4 weeks. In a letter to donor nations, the UN agency said food aid would have to be rationed off if the new funds are not received by May 1st. The World Food Program said its funding gap is largely caused by soaring food prices as well as record-high oil prices. The governor of Kansas, Kathleen Sebelius, has vetoed a measure to allow for the construction of 2 new coal-fired power plants. The plants would have produced up to 11 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions. The New York Times reports new government research has found large and growing disparities in life expectancy for richer and poorer Americans, paralleling the growth of income inequality in the last 2 decades. There's now a 4.5-year gap in the life expectancy between the country's most affluent and most deprived. In the early 80s, the gap was less than 3 years. The gap between poor African-American men and affluent white women is now more than 14 years. In media news, the business publication Crain's reports Rupert Murdoch wants to buy a 3rd daily newspaper in New York, the Long Island-based Newsday. Murdoch's News Corp already owns the New York Post, Wall Street Journal, and 2 major TV stations in New York. Newsday is currently owned by the Tribune Company. A federal district court has ruled the National Park Service violated the First Amendment rights of anti-war protesters when it excluded them from a major section of President Bush's 2005 inaugural parade route. The decision came in a lawsuit brought by the Answer Coalition. In Belgium, police arrested nearly 500 demonstrators Saturday at a peace demonstration outside the NATO headquarters in Brussels. The protest came just days after the 5th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Protest organizers accused NATO of being an instrument of U.S. policy in Iraq and Afghanistan.
The Belgian government was very much against the war, but at the same time we saw a whole U.S. army passing Belgium on their way to Iraq. And the reason why they said it like, yeah, that's NATO. We are in NATO, we have to accept that. But for all European countries, you always see that sort of policies, which means that NATO is in a certain sense the limit of your foreign policy, which is for us reason enough to question NATO.
Police used dogs, horses, pepper spray, clubs, and water cannon to prevent the protesters from entering the NATO grounds. In Chicago, 6 peace activists disrupted Easter Mass Sunday at the Holy Name Cathedral by staging a die-in where they squirted fake blood on themselves to protest the Iraq War. The activists called themselves the Catholic Schoolgirls Against the War. The protest occurred during the 11 o'clock Mass at the Holy Name Cathedral, Chicago's most prominent Catholic parish. The protesters were all charged with felony criminal damage to property and 2 counts of simple battery for squirting the blood around the auditorium and onto worshippers' clothes. Meanwhile, in Binghamton, New York, a group of student anti-war activists are accusing the local police of using excessive force to break up a protest last week near the State University of New York at Binghamton. Police reportedly fired pepper spray at 10 protesters, in some cases at point-blank range. The police tried to break up the peaceful demonstration after activists started marching in one of the city's busiest roadways. Several protesters held a sign reading, quote, "Occupation is murder." The police made 9 arrests. The former 1970s radical Sarah Jane Olson is back behind bars just days after she was released from prison following a 7-year term. Olson was rearrested Friday after a corrections official claimed an administrative error resulted in her early release. Olson's attorney, Sean Chapman-Halley, criticized the move. He said, quote, "It's like they make up all new rules when it comes to her. It's like we're in some kind of fascist state," he said. Sarah Jane Olson, formerly known as Kathleen Celaya, was a member of the Symbionese Liberation Army, the group best known for kidnapping the newspaper heiress Patty Hearst. Olson was arrested in 1999 after living underground for 25 years. She's now scheduled to be released next year. And the legendary Cuban composer and bassist Israel Cachao Lopez has died at the age of 89. He transformed the rhythm of Cuban music in the 30s and is credited with inventing the mambo. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.